Welcome back to The Deep Dive. This is the show where we take a vast stack of source material, often just overwhelming, and we distill it down to the essential knowledge you really need. And today, we are tackling something colossal. I mean, truly colossal in its scope and its influence. Something that has shaped global literature, ethics, law, history itself. We're talking about the Old Testament.
It's a massive undertaking.
It is. And if you're like most people, when you think of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, you probably picture this one. Single, thick, frankly, a pretty confusing book.
Right. Something you feel like you should read, but you just wouldn't know where to even begin.
Exactly. So our core insight today, the nugget we want to start with, is this. It is fundamentally not a book. It is a library. A complex foundational library filled with diverse texts compiled over centuries.
And understanding that, seeing it as a library, is the absolute key.
Yeah.
It unlocks everything.
It really does. Imagine walking into a library and thinking it's all just one subject.
You'd be completely lost.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're going to give you a clear conversational roadmap for this library. We're going to navigate its entire epic arc by looking at 10 pivotal stories, the ones that really define it.
And we'll pull out the most important insights from each one. So by the end of this deep dive, you'll have a solid grasp of the narrative engine and the core concepts that drive what is, well, arguably the most foundational text in human history.
Let's get into it.
So to start with that idea of structure, what we call the Old Testament it's a collection of texts. They were written, edited, and canonized over roughly 1,000 years?
1,000 years. That's incredible.
It is. And it's so diverse. You've got law codes right next to song lyrics, historical chronicles, philosophical debates, political warnings. It's all bound together.
So for clarity's sake, in many of the Protestant English Bibles, like one our source material uses, it's a collection of 39 distinct books.
That's right. It runs from Genesis right through to Malachi. And we should, just briefly acknowledge that other traditions handle it differently. Jewish tradition, for instance, often groups them as Torah, prophets, and writings. And Catholic and Orthodox traditions include some additional texts, sometimes called the Apocrypha.
But the core story we're tracing today, that's shared, right?
Absolutely. The foundational narrative, ark creation, promise, failure, recovery. That story is central to all of them.
Okay, good. So let's get to the map. Because walking into this material without a map really is overwhelming. We can break this library down into 4 main wings, let's say.
That's a good way to put it.
The first wing, the absolute foundation, is the Torah. You'll often hear it translated as the law. These are the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Genesis sets the stage, but the others, they really detail the foundational instructions.
This is where the terms of the relationship between the people and the divine are really defined. It covers everything from, ritual purity to incredibly detailed social equity rules.
Right. It's about organizing a former slave population into a functioning holy nation.
Exactly. Then, moving on from there, you enter the second wing, the narrative books, or sometimes called the historical books.
And these pick up right where the Torah leaves off.
They do. They chronicle the story of the people trying to live under that law. You see the initial conquest of the land in Joshua, then these periods of chaos in Judges.
The rise and fall of kings.
Right, in Samuel and Kings, and then finally the destruction and the eventual return from exile in books like Ezra and Nehemiah.
So it's like their historical report card. How did they actually do?
That's a perfect way to describe it. How did human leaders perform when they were tested by the law?
And then, after all that history, you get this beautiful, reflective break in the action, the third wing, wisdom and poetry.
This is the human experience of it all. It's the heart and soul of the library, I think.
I agree. It has the emotional song lyrics and prayers of the Psalms, the pragmatic, day-to-day ethical advice and Proverbs.
And then you have these intense philosophical works like Job and Ecclesiastes, which are wrestling with huge universal questions.
Like, why do good people suffer? Or what's the meaning of any of this?
Exactly. It's the mind of the tradition laid bare.
Okay, and the final wing.
The prophets. These are often grouped into major and minor prophets, not based on importance, but just on the length of their scrolls.
So what's their function?
They are the internal moral watchdog of the nation. They are delivering messages of immediate critique, correction, warnings, but also future hope.
So prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah.
Precisely. They relentlessly hold everyone, the kings, the priests, the common people, accountable to the foundational law that was laid out back in the Torah.
Okay, that 4-part structure is a great map. But to really understand the story's engine, how it all works, we need to master 4 essential concepts.
Yes. These are the terms you'll see over and over again.
Let's start with the one that holds it all together, covenant.
Right. And this is often reduced to just contract, but it's so much deeper than that. A covenant is a solemn, divinely binding agreement. It sets the entire non-negotiable terms of a relationship.
It's not just a business deal.
No. It defines identity, duties, expectations, and the consequences for failure.
So if we need an analogy, maybe think of it less like a business agreement and more like a constitutional contract, a founding document.
It's very good. It grants identity, and it stipulates fundamental duties. You see it with Noah, promising to preserve the earth, with Abraham's promise of land and descendants.
And then the big one at Sinai, which binds the community through the law.
Right. And breaking this is catastrophic. You're not just breaking a rule, you are breaking the constitutional basis of your very existence.
Which leads directly to the second concept, exile.
It does. If the covenant is the constitutional agreement, exile is the pre-written consequence for catastrophic failure. It's the terror and violence of being driven out of your homeland.
So the analogy here has to be severe. It's like losing your citizenship, your home, your standing in the community.
And being forced to live scattered under foreign oppressive rule. You see it warned about in Deuteronomy, and then you see it tragically play out in the history books.
It haunts them.
It absolutely haunts the memory of the people. It proves their very existence is conditional on justice and the law.
Okay, third concept, the prophet. As you said, they weren't just fortune tellers.
Not primarily, no. They were fundamentally a spokesperson, a mouth for the divine message. Their main role was to deliver an immediate message, usually questioning the moral integrity of the current leadership.
Because they knew what was at stake.
Exactly. They knew that covenant failure leads to exile.
So a good analogy might be a government watchdog, or an investigative journalist who operates within the system but whose only loyalty is to those founding principles, the covenant and the law.
I like that. They speak truth to power. They admonish kings, judges, priests, reminding them that their rituals are empty if they abandon justice.
Okay, last one, wisdom.
Yes, and this one is so practical, especially in a book like Proverbs. It's not abstract knowledge. It's the practical skill and moral understanding you need to live rightly and ethically in the world, day to day.
I love the analogy for this one. It's like street smarts blended with deep ethical intelligence.
That's perfect. Proverbs describes it as acquiring a disciplined and prudent life, doing what is right and just and fair.
It's the ability to see the right path in life, making sure your daily choices line up with the law's bigger vision for society.
Exactly. So these 4 concepts, covenant, exile, prophet, and wisdom, they're the lens we need to view these 10 pivotal stories.
Okay, let's transition now to the core of this deep dive. These 10 events. They're not just historical markers, are they?
No, not at all. They are the narrative milestones. They trace that whole creation to return timeline, and they show us exactly how those 4 concepts we just discussed actually play out in human history.
And we're going to move through them conversationally, giving them the depth they deserve. Let's start at the very beginning. Story 1, creation.
Where it is, Genesis chapter 1, what happens? The story starts with the earth described as tohu wabohu, formless and empty. It's chaos and darkness.
And then over this very structured 7-day period, a divine presence brings light from darkness and order from that chaos.
It's a very systematic sequence. It moves from establishing the environments, sky, land, seas, to then filling those environments with life.
But the real culmination is on day 6, right? The focus shifts entirely to humanity.
It does. The text says humans are created in the divine image. And this isn't just about physical appearance. It's about function.
What's the function?
They're immediately given a clear, dual responsibility to rule over and subdue the earth. It's a kind of regal custodial role.
And the final assessment of the whole thing is key. Very good.
Yes. So the big idea here is order and vocation. The cosmos isn't random. It's intentionally designed, structured, and it's inherently good.
And that divine image thing, that means humanity's role is to be representatives of that order on Earth.
Exactly. They're meant to be the agents of maintenance and governance. This sets the standard. Humanity has a sacred purpose, a vocation to steward creation, not to exploit it.
And that idea of vocation is so crucial for all the ethical arguments that come later. If you're made in the divine image, you have inherent value, which means you have to treat others with that same respect.
Precisely. And why it's famous? Well, This narrative sets the foundation for Western cosmology and ethics, but maybe most practically, it establishes that fundamental rhythm of life.
Work and rest.
The cycle of work and rest, culminating in the Sabbath, the seventh day, dedicated to rest because the Creator rested. And as we'll see, that principle of rest becomes a powerful tool for social equity later on.
But of course, a perfect order that depends on human choice. It's fragile.
It is. Which brings us immediately to the first big challenge.
Story 2, Eden in the fall.
Where it is, Genesis chapters 2 and 3.
What happens? The first humans are placed in the Garden of Eden, a place of peace and provision. They're given huge freedom, but one critical boundary.
Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or you will surely die.
And then the serpent comes along and challenges that boundary, right? Appealing to their desire for autonomy.
Exactly. The pitch is, eating the fruit will make you like God, knowing good and evil.
And they make the choice. They disobey.
And the immediate result is the shattering of that peace.
Right.
They realize they're naked, which leads to intense shame. But it's their response that really defines the crisis.
The blame game.
The blame game. Instead of taking responsibility, the man blames the woman, and he implicitly blames the Creator who gave him the woman. And the woman turns around and blames the serpent.
And the consequences are huge. They're banished from Eden. The world itself becomes resistant to them. Painful work, thorns and thistles.
And mortality enters the story. For dust you are, and to dust you will return.
So the big idea is fracture and responsibility.
Yes, this story introduces the fundamental human problem.
Yeah.
Disobedience leads to the shattering of a perfect relationship. It's the narrative engine that explains why life involves suffering, toil, and that immediate tendency to deflect blame.
It's the loss of innocence.
And the introduction of moral choice outside of divine guidance. Why it's famous is pretty clear. It's the source of these universal cultural themes. Shame, guilt, the pain of labor, the difficulty in relationships. It's the moment that explains how perfection became flawed.
And as humanity multiplies outside of Eden, that failure of responsibility and the violence that follows, it just escalates.
It escalates dramatically, leading to a massive threat to creation itself.
Which brings us to story number 3, Noah and the flood.
Where it is, Genesis chapters 6 through 9.
What happens? The language here is incredibly stark. It says that man's wickedness on the earth had become great and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time.
And crucially, the earth itself had become corrupted and full of violence. This isn't just moral failure. It's a systemic corruption of the entire planet.
So because of this, the narrative says God regretted creating mankind and resolved to destroy all living creatures.
With the works, though, we see the introduction of a new concept. The faithful remnant. Noah is found to be righteous and blameless.
And he's commanded to build this massive ark to preserve himself, his family, and representative pairs of all living things. It's an incredible undertaking.
It's survival on the grandest scale. The floodwaters cover the earth, destroying everything else. But once the waters recede, a pivotal covenant is immediately established.
This is the Noahic covenant.
Yes. And it's made not just with Noah, but with all living things. A promise to never again destroy the earth by water. And the rainbow is the eternal sign of that promise.
So the big idea here is judgment and preservation.
Right. It's a dramatic demonstration of justice against corruption and violence, but it's immediately coupled with this enduring commitment to preserve creation through a faithful remnant.
It also establishes some foundational human laws, right? Like accountability for bloodshed.
Exactly. A law that holds regardless of nation because humanity still retains that divine image. Why it's famous? I mean, it's the classic globally recognized tale of catastrophe and survival.
Yeah.
And culturally, it establishes the rainbow as this enduring symbol of promise.
But preserving Noah's family only gets us so far. To fulfill that original design of blessing the world, the focus had to narrow, right? It had to land on one specific family line.
It did. Which leads us directly to the selection of Abraham.
Story 4, Abraham and the covenant promise.
Where it is, Genesis chapters 12, 15, and 17.
What happened? So Abram is living this comfortable life, and he's called to make a radical departure. Leave his country, his people, his father's house, and travel to a land he's never even seen.
It's a huge act of trust. And in exchange for this, God makes the critical 3-part Abrahamic covenant promise.
Okay, what are the 3 parts?
First, he will receive the promised land. Second, he'll have countless descendants, like the stars in the sky. And third, and this is the big one that's often forgotten, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you.
So it connects his specific mission back to the universal blessing of creation.
Precisely. The covenant is confirmed, his name is changed from Abram to Abraham, which means father of many nations, and the rite of circumcision is established as the sign of this promise.
So the big idea is identity and destiny.
Yes, this is the moment of selection that initiates the specific identity of Israel. And it's founded purely on an unconditional promise, a covenant, not on any performance or merit.
Right. They were chosen because they were the least of the nations, not the greatest.
Exactly. Their whole identity is now defined by this destiny to receive a land and eventually become a blessing for the whole world. Why it's famous? Well, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the defining fathers of the tradition. And that land grant motivates so much of the subsequent history.
And that promise of descendants was fulfilled, leading to the complicated family of Jacob.
Very complicated. But one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, faces this terrible betrayal that paradoxically ends up saving the entire family line and shifting their location dramatically.
Story 5, Joseph in Egypt.
Where it is. This is the end of Genesis, chapters 37 through 50.
What happens? Joseph is the favored son. He's a dreamer. He's sold into slavery by his jealous brothers. It's a story of incredible suffering.
It is. But through his unique administrative gifts and his ability to interpret dreams, which he always attributes to the divine, he rises spectacularly in the Egyptian court. He goes from prisoner to the second most powerful man in the entire country.
And when a severe famine strikes, his foresight saves Egypt. And eventually he has this dramatic revelation to his brothers.
But instead of revenge, he forgives them completely. He brings his whole family, Jacob, and the emerging tribes to live safely in the rich land of Goshen during the famine.
So the big idea here is providence and preservation.
Yes, and this is philosophically critical. It directly confronts the problem of human evil. It shows how betrayal and injustice can be paradoxically used by a greater power for a redemptive good.
Ensuring the survival of the covenant family.
Joseph's words to his brothers summarize it perfectly. He says, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, to bring about what is now happening, the saving of many lives."
That idea that personal hardship can serve a larger unseen destiny, that's an incredibly powerful theme.
It is. Why it's famous? It's a powerful story of fortune reversal, deep forgiveness, and the triumph of providence. But it also sets the stage for the next massive historical event.
Because after Joseph dies, things change.
Decades pass. The family grows numerous, but the welcome mat is pulled out from under them. They face a crisis of identity under brutal slavery, and they need a dramatic rescue.
Story 6, Exodus and Passover.
Where it is. Exodus chapters 1 through 15.
What happens? The now massive Israelite population is enslaved by a new, fearful Pharaoh. It's brutal, state-sponsored labor, and Moses, raised in Pharaoh's own household, is called to lead them out.
It's a huge geopolitical confrontation. As Pharaoh refuses to release his slave labor, a series of 10 increasingly severe plagues hits Egypt. The final one, the death of the firstborn, is averted only by the Israelites performing the Passover ritual.
Applying the blood of a lamb to their doorposts, which spares their homes.
It's the critical difference between death and life. Pharaoh finally relents, but then he pursues them to the Red Sea.
And then comes the most dramatic moment of the entire narrative.
The miraculous parting of the water. Israel escapes on dry ground, and the Egyptian army is engulfed. This event permanently defines them as a redeemed, liberated people.
So the big idea is liberation and identity.
This is the single most defining moment in the entire Old Testament. Israel becomes a nation, not by birthright, but by redemption from slavery.
And their entire existence is anchored in that memory.
Absolutely. The constant refrain throughout the rest of the law is, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, but the Lord rescued you. That memory becomes the mandate for their future ethical behavior.
Why it's famous is clear. The Exodus is the ultimate cultural touchstone for freedom movements, the triumph of the vulnerable over tyrannical power.
And it establishes that persistent theme that the divine presence actively works for justice for the oppressed.
So they're physically free, but they're just this massive, unorganized group of former slaves in the desert. They need structure. They need a constitution.
Exactly. And they receive that blueprint at Mount Sinai.
Story 7, Sinai and the Ten Commandments.
Where it is. Exodus chapters 19 and 20.
What happens? The liberated people arrive at Mount Sinai, and there's this spectacular, terrifying divine encounter. God gives them the covenant, saying if they obey, they will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation.
And the Ten Commandments are the core of that agreement. They outline foundational duties toward the divine and duties toward your neighbor.
So the big idea is law as social architecture. And we really need to spend some time here. The law is not just a list of do-nots.
No, it's the constitution of their freedom. It's designed to establish a righteous, equitable society that is intentionally different from the unjust systems of Egypt.
The law is formative. It dictates how a free people must live.
And it's so practical. Let's look at some concrete examples from our sources that show this commitment to social equity.
Okay, first, Sabbath and rest. The command to keep the seventh day holy extends explicitly beyond the citizen family. It covers your son, your daughter, your servants, your animals.
Even the alien within your gates. This is radical. It legally guarantees rest and prevents the indefinite exploitation of the most vulnerable laborers.
It forces everyone to stop and remember their own past as slaves.
Exactly. Second, the care for the vulnerable. The law is obsessed with protecting those outside the power structure. It explicitly mandates justice for the alien or the fatherless and prohibits taking a widow's essential belongings as a pledge for a loan.
And the ethical reason is tied directly to their memory. Love him as yourself, for you were aliens in Egypt.
The trauma of their oppression is transformed into a mandate for empathy. It's powerful.
And a third example, economic regulation.
This is fascinating. The law had built-in mechanisms to prevent absolute poverty. When you harvested your crops, you were commanded not to reap the corners of your field or gather every last bit.
You had to leave them for the poor and the alien.
Yes. It enshrined a baseline of food security. It prevented the total concentration of resources and ensured the most vulnerable always had access to sustenance. Why it's famous. These commandments and the wider law form the ethical foundation for vast parts of global legal and moral systems.
So the law provides this perfect theoretical blueprint. But the historical question is, how do imperfect people actually implement it?
And that requires effective human leadership, which leads us to the rise of kingship, and most famously, to David.
Story 8, David and kingship.
Where it is, 1 Samuel chapters 16 and 17, and then 2 Samuel chapters 5 through 7.
What happens? After years of chaos, the people demand a king. The prophet Samuel anoints David, a shepherd chosen not for his size, but for his character. He proves his courage by defeating Goliath.
Right, and he goes on to consolidate power, capture Jerusalem, and establish it as the political capital.
But the real hinge point is in 2 Samuel 7. He receives a dynastic covenant.
Yes. God promises David that his royal lineage, his throne, would be established forever. This promise becomes the central stabilizing hope for the entire future of the kingdom.
The belief that even if the current king fails, an ultimate ruler from David's line will eventually appear.
Exactly. So the big idea here is the ideal versus reality of power. David represents the ideal king, a ruler who is supposed to govern with justice and righteousness. The promise is unconditional.
But the history books quickly show that human rulers, including David himself, inevitably fall short of this perfect standard.
And that creates the essential narrative conflict, this gap between the divine expectation and flawed earthly authority. The kings have this promise, but they're constantly judged based on their adherence to the law from Sinai.
Why it's famous, David is the quintessential warrior king, the great poet, and the hope for a future, perfect, just ruler is permanently tied to his lineage.
But since the kings were responsible for upholding that social architecture, their inevitable flaws provoked severe public warnings. When they ignored the law's mandate for justice, the prophets stepped in.
Forcefully.
Very forcefully.
Story 9, prophetic confrontation, specifically Isaiah's critique of injustice.
Where it is, the book of Isaiah, chapters 1 and 5.
What happens? Isaiah is speaking to the rulers of Judah. It's a time of prosperity, but deep corruption. The leaders are doing all the right religious ceremonies, sacrifices, festivals, Sabbaths.
But Isaiah declares that these rituals are meaningless, unacceptable.
Yeah.
Why? Because their hands are full of injustice and bloodshed.
And he gets incredibly specific. He says the rulers are rebels, companions of thieves, who take bribes and actively do not defend the cause of the fatherless or the widow.
And in chapter 5, he delivers a series of woes on the wealthy elite who are using their legal power to seize land, pushing the poor off their ancestral properties while they live in luxury.
This is the government watchdog role at its sharpest.
It is. And Isaiah warns them that this profound ethical failure will lead to the nation being consumed by divine anger and utter destruction.
So the big idea is justice over ritual.
Yes. This cemented the social critique element of the entire Old Testament. Prophecy is an unflinching moral compass, insisting that true covenant faithfulness is demonstrated in how you treat others, especially the marginalized.
Not just in performing religious ceremonies.
For the prophets, ethical behavior is utterly inseparable from spiritual devotion. why it's famous. It defined the prophetic mission as holding power relentlessly accountable. And it established this enduring idea that true worship has to lead to tangible righteousness in society.
And those persistent warnings from Isaiah and later prophets, they were largely ignored.
They were. And as the law predicted, this covenant failure resulted in the collapse of the kingdom and the ultimate crisis of identity, the devastating experience of exile.
Which brings us to our final story. Story 10, Exile and Survival, as seen in Ezra-Nehemiah.
Where it is, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah near the end of the narrative section.
What happens? After the catastrophic military collapse and the scattering of the people into Babylon, a remnant is eventually allowed to return to the ruined city of Jerusalem.
And the story shifts from political drama to civic and spiritual rebuilding. Ezra, a priest and teacher well-versed in the law of Moses, arrives to lead this reformation.
And the most profound moment is when the people gather in the public square and Ezra reads the book of the law of Moses aloud to them.
Something that hadn't been done faithfully for generations. And this act of listening is transformative. The people weep. They realize the full scope of their collective failure. They see that the exile was the direct, predicted punishment for breaking the covenant.
And they formally renew their commitment to follow the law, marking the reestablishment of the community, centered now on instruction rather than on a king.
So the big idea is resilience and redefinition of identity. This narrative proves that the covenant people can survive the loss of their state, their kings, their land, and still retain their identity.
By turning inward and centering their existence on the foundational laws and promises.
It demonstrates this enduring hope and the possibility of restoration even after political annihilation. Why it's famous. This story is crucial for understanding post-exilic identity. It shows the transition from a political nation ruled by kings to a resilient community defined by its law and its shared stories.
The law, in the end, proved more enduring than the monarchy.
It did. So we've completed this sweeping historical cycle, from perfect creation to fracture, through the promises and redemption, the failure of kings, the warnings of prophets, and ultimate survival. Now we can step back and synthesize the legacy of this incredible collection.
Okay, let's unpack this. We've covered a massive amount of territory, but if you hold on to those 10 stories, a clear, powerful 7-point through line emerges that really defines the entire narrative.
He really does.
1. Creation. God established a good, orderly world and gave humanity a vital custodial role within it.
2. Fracture. Human choice, stemming from that desire for autonomous knowledge, broke the perfect relationship. It introduced toil, death, and conflict.
3. Covenant. God intervened. He didn't abandon the world, but initiated a relationship based on promise, specifically the covenant made to Abraham.
4. Liberation. The descendants of Abraham were rescued from the ultimate oppression slavery in Egypt in the defining redemptive moment of the Exodus.
5. Law. A blueprint for a just, equitable community was established at Sinai, giving the liberated slaves a new social and moral architecture.
6. Leadership and critique. The kings constantly failed to uphold that architecture, which forced the prophets to rise up as that internal moral watchdog, demanding social justice over empty ritual.
And 7. Collapse, survival, and hope. Disobedience led to political destruction, the exile. But the community showed incredible resilience and rebuilt its identity by returning to the core covenant and the law.
That cycle of order, failure, and restoration. That is the essence of this library.
And understanding that through line allows us to pull out 5 major practical takeaways that still influence modern life, regardless of your personal beliefs.
The first takeaway is its influence on literature and art. The Old Testament is pure source code. It gave us the foundations for so many archetypes, dramatic narrative, profound poetry.
Like the Psalms.
Exactly. Whether it's Psalm 8 reflecting on humanity's high place in creation, or the sweeping grandeur of Psalm 104 describing the natural world, this material just informs global storytelling.
Takeaway 2, foundational ethics and law. It's a primary source for universal justice principles. As we saw at Sinai, the law established that justice has to prioritize the protection of the powerless, the poor, the fatherless, the widow, the alien.
That persistent focus on the marginalized is a defining feature.
Takeaway 3, leadership accountability. This library provides a constant radical check on those in power.
It does. The wisdom literature, like Proverbs, states clearly that a king ensures a country's stability by justice, but one greedy for bribes tears it down. The entire prophetic movement existed to ensure leaders could never accumulate power without moral scrutiny.
Takeaway 4, suffering and meaning. Through these intense philosophical works like Job and Ecclesiastes, the text deeply addresses the universal human question of suffering.
And it refuses to offer simplistic, tidy answers to pain. Ecclesiastes explores the seeming meaninglessness of life, but encourages a search for wisdom and appreciation for simple happiness, acknowledging the limits of our knowledge.
And finally, takeaway 5, resilience and identity.
The whole historical arc, culminating in Nehemiah, is a profound manual for cultural survival. It teaches that identity can be maintained and rebuilt after catastrophic political loss by holding fast to shared narratives and foundational instructions. It's the ultimate story of enduring cultural hope.
Now let's wrap up by just quickly correcting 3 stubborn misconceptions we often hear about the Old Testament.
It's an idea.
Misconception 1, the Old Testament is only rules. The correction here is that this completely misses the context. The laws are always embedded in the story of redemption.
Right. They're prefaced by the declaration. We were slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out. Therefore, keep these commands. The rules are the blueprint for how to live as a free and just people because they were set free.
They tell them how to be free, not just what they must do.
Exactly. Misconception 2. It is one genre.
Which we've seen is absolutely not true. This collection is dramatically layered. You've got legal codes, history, song lyrics, business advice, existential philosophy. It's an entire intellectual world in one volume.
And misconception 3. It just affirms power and the status quo.
Again, the opposite is true. The entire prophetic tradition we saw with Isaiah functions as a radical, consistent internal critique of power structures. They consistently condemn kings and judges who practice injustice.
They make it clear that authority without equity is tyranny.
So to bring it all home,
the sheer scope of the Old Testament confirms that the human journey is this constant cycle, establishing order, facing catastrophic fracture, attempting to rebuild, and ultimately reckoning with the consequences of moral failure.
So what's the challenge it leaves us with today?
I think the challenge, after tracing this entire historical movement, is not just to absorb the knowledge of history or law, but to apply wisdom. This ancient library reminds us, again and again, that true prosperity, whether for a person or a nation, is ultimately measured by an unwavering commitment to justice and ethical living for all.
Especially for those outside the power structure.
Especially for them. That ethical mandate is the lasting wisdom of this deep dive.